Estamos aquí con Rodney Benson. Él es jefe del Departamento de Medios, Cultura y Comunicaciones de la Universidad de New York University, NYU, en Nueva York. También es profesor en esa escuela y es profesor también en Sociología, en el Departamento de Sociología de la New York University. Su investigación se centra en el análisis comparado de los medios de comunicación, la producción de la cultura, los temas de medios de comunicación e inmigración, y todos estos temas son aspectos sobre los que ha publicado en muchas revistas académicas, en numerosas revistas de este campo. Es el autor de un libro que se llama Shaping Immigration News, a French-American Comparison, una comparación entre las noticias sobre inmigración en Estados Unidos y Francia, que se publicó por la editorial de Cambridge el año 2013 y que ha recibido 3 importantes premios de libros en los años 2014 y 2015. Este libro no solamente aborda la forma en que los medios tratan las noticias de inmigración en estos dos países, en Francia y en Estados Unidos, sino que también presenta una contribución metodológica a los trabajos sobre investigación comparada de medios de comunicación, que le sirve a otras personas que estén trabajando sobre temas de medios de comunicación en perspectiva comparada. También es coeditor de un libro del año 2005 que se llama Bourdieu y el campo periodístico, Bourdieu and the Journalistic Field, y es coautor de Public Media and Political Independence, que es un libro publicado el año 2011. Está aquí como orador principal de nuestra conferencia COES, de nuestra reunión de 3 días en Santiago, en la conferencia Concentraciones, y el profesor Benson nos dio una primicia, como dirían los periodistas, de su libro How Media Ownership Matters, en cómo importa o en qué influye la propiedad de los medios. Y de eso fue lo que habló el miércoles en su conferencia inaugural de la conferencia COES. Este libro, How Media Ownership Matters, va a presentarnos los resultados de investigación de un trabajo empírico que se realizó en Suecia, Francia y Estados Unidos. Y como explicó nuestro invitado el día miércoles, su objetivo es ir más allá de la idea de la concentración de medios para hablar cómo influyen las distintas formas de propiedad de los medios, o sea, si los medios pertenecen a una familia, por ejemplo, o como ocurre frecuentemente en Chile, ¿no? La mayoría de nuestros medios grandes de comunicación son propiedad de una familia claramente identificable, o si son compañías que se transan en la bolsa y que tienen que producir ganancia, o si pertenecen al Estado o a algún grupo de la sociedad civil, cómo estos tipos de propiedad inciden en la forma en que se hace el periodismo y en la forma en que se presentan las noticias. Así que, profesor Benson, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'll start asking you, you're a sociologist, but as myself and many scholars in Chile, you started as an undergraduate studying journalism and mass communication. So I wanted to ask you, what drove you personally to study the media? What do you think is the connection between these two areas?
Well, I think my interest in the media came not just from writing for newspapers and magazines, but also from the 7 years I spent working in politics in Washington, D.C. And the experience I had working from that side and seeing how the policy process was sometimes distorted, often ignored by journalism. And so I really felt that the problem was, how do we have a kind of journalism that really takes seriously the issues, the structural problems in society, and so that drove me to study sociology to get a deeper perspective on those issues as well. And ultimately, I've been really interested in comparative research in France, in Scandinavia, because they offer really kind of a different model of a media system, less commercialized, that shows that the media don't have to always operate in the way that we take for granted in the United States. And so some of the problems that we have, I think, could be solved by various kinds of media reform and media policy change.
So you think there are lessons to be learned from comparing the way the media works in different countries?
Absolutely. So that's been a big part of my research.
So let me ask you about your upcoming book, which deals precisely with this, which compares the media. The book is How Media Ownership Matters. Tell us how you came about with this question and what were your findings after conducting all those interviews and all this field work, all this field research. Were you surprised by what you found?
Yes, well, the project really started with a grant that I got from a Swedish foundation that wanted to sponsor research on media ownership. And initially I thought, well, I don't think this is a really interesting question. What can we learn that hasn't already been said? And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought that, if we can move the debate beyond the kind of focus on concentration of media, which is important, but think about the different forms of ownership. So for instance, if we don't think about the forms of ownership, the different kinds of ownership, public, stock market, traded, privately held, civil society media, these different forms of ownership, I think we're really missing a big part of the story. So, for example, Ben Bakdikian wrote many books on the media monopoly, and he documented the path from 50 big companies owning all the media to 10 to 5. But honestly, I think if there are 50 companies, but they're all the same kind of companies,
right.
They're all stock market companies, it doesn't really, that's not really the issue is not how many companies. You could have only 10 or 20 companies, but if it was a real diversification of forms, that could be better than 50 or 100 companies. So this project has really been about refocusing how we talk about ownership in a way that can, I think, actually go beyond the concentration debate, go beyond antitrust, which is important, but is not enough.
But the concentration, so you see a correlation between the concentration of the media and the ownership of the media and the types of ownership?
Well, yes. So if you look at the absolute levels of concentration, actually the U.S. is not that high compared to the other leading media economies in the world. It's actually at the bottom of the top 30, and I think Chile is somewhere in the middle, and let's say Russia and China are the very top. So, that if you just look at the concentration of the raw concentration of the market, the U.S. is not that bad, and yet clearly we have some problems. So then, if you look more closely at the kinds of companies that dominate in the largest media, they all tend to be stock market traded companies or private equity hedge fund owned. And so it's a hyper commercial form. It's a form of ownership that's not just about profits, but about maximizing profits to 25, 30% and doing whatever it takes to achieve those profits. And that's really the problem. So it is concentration, but it's concentration not just a number of firms, but the type of firm, particular type of firm in the United States.
So would you say, so one thing is the concentration in relation to the type of ownership.
Absolutely.
And another thing is the type of ownership in relation to the ideological diversity. Do you think there's a correlation also in the ideological diversity of the media?
Well, I think I don't know there's necessarily a big ideological difference between stock market traded and other kinds of commercial privately held media. In the broadest sense, they're not going to fundamentally challenge the capitalist system, and there's a kind of status quo orientation. I think the problem.
But then, who does that in the U.S.?
Who challenges the status quo? I'll get to that in a moment, because there are alternative media, there's smaller media, there's non-profit media that are doing something slightly different. So I'll get to that in a moment. But the problem with the hyper-commercial media is the sensationalism and being focused on ratings above all else, and we really see this in the way they've covered Trump. And so Trump has been the president who has known how to play the media like no other president in history. There was a study that showed the first month in office of Trump compared to Obama, and it showed what was the value of the free media attention that the two presidents received. It was almost worth $1 billion US dollars that Trump had received versus maybe a couple $100 million for Obama. So just out of proportion to anything we've seen before. And the media, even CNN, even the networks, not just Fox, but these networks that are supposedly critical of Trump. The most important thing, I think, is not whether they're critical or not, but how much they cover him. And they give him saturation coverage because they know
that sells.
It sells. And there was a famous quote by the head of CBS who said, Trump may not be good for America, but he's damn good for CBS. And that just tells you the attitude, and it continues. So that's a product of this hyper-commercialization, that they cannot pull back even when they know it's the right thing to do. It's not a matter of covering Trump or not covering Trump. You have to cover the president. but feeling that they have to always cover him because they know that's what drives the audience and the ratings, and feeling that they can't pull back because their profits will go down, that's the problem.
So how would you summarize the effect of media ownership? How would you summarize the argument of the book?
The argument of the book looks at these four broad forms of ownership, and then it says, how does ownership matter? And it really, I think, matters in three broad ways. One is what I call political instrumentalism, another is economic instrumentalism, and the other is public service orientation. So these are the three, and I can talk about each of those in turn. But economic instrumentalism is when and these are modes of what I call modes of ownership power. And I should mention this is part of a book I'm working on with a Swedish colleague, Mattias Hesseris, at the Axios Foundation and Uppsala University, and Julie Sedell from the University of Strasbourg. Economic instrumentalism is when a media organization uses its mouthpiece essentially to promote its economic interests. Well, obviously profits is one of those, but another would be with a large conglomerate where, let's say, for example, a classic example is ABC TV News, which is owned by Disney Corporation, and so they're constantly plugging Disney. Now they'll even admit it. You'll say we're owned by Disney, and then they'll shamelessly plug the next Disney movie. And so this is what I mean by economic instrumentalism. Or for example, Amazon. So there's two, I think, ways. One is you promote your associated interest through the news. The other way is you keep your company out of the news. So that's one of the concerns with the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. So it's not technically owned by Amazon, but it's owned by the owner of Amazon. And in a lot of ways, Bezos has improved the Washington Post. It's been very critical of Trump, but there are concerns. How critically are they covering Amazon? Are they keeping Amazon out of the news? And so a classic example was the New York Times was really the first news organization to do a critical study, a critical article about the bad working conditions at Amazon. And the Washington Post, how did they respond to this? 2 days later, they responded with a story that basically the headline was, is it really that awful to work for Amazon? I mean, just a total apologetic piece.
So you see a conflict of interest there? Should there be regulations to prevent conflict of interest like that?
I don't know how to regulate it, but you have to keep a close eye on it. And I think the answer to ownership, one of the answers to ownership is you just need a diversity of owners, a diversity of ownership forms, because every media outlet has its blind spots and has its weaknesses. And so we're not going to go to the Washington Post to look for good Amazon coverage, clearly. And as long as there's other media that keep them into check. But I mean, also we need to look hard at the way the Washington Post and the power it has serves as a way to make it difficult for people to regulate Amazon, right? So it's not so much about regulating the Washington Post, but is the Washington Post protect Amazon in a way? And it's difficult to make this critique because Trump has made this critique as well, but he's doing it from a very self-interested perspective because he doesn't like the criticism from the Washington Post. But anybody who's concerned with antitrust, with corporate concentration in general, has to be concerned about the Washington Post and Amazon. So that's economic instrumentalism. Political instrumentalism is when the media owner uses that media outlet to promote some politician or political cause. And often it's been said in the past that, well, that's often when you get a media outlet that's not really profitable. So why do they own it? Well, it has this...
that was the reason for many media to be born in the first place. Many of the old newspapers were born out of political parties or political groups.
That's a very old tradition for media organizations and goes back to the late 18th century at least. And so it's always been there. It's been, I think, more and more lessened by the professionalization of journalism and the separation of news and opinion at many news organizations. So a lot of news organizations want to minimize that kind of political bias, or they try to. And so it's just a range, but some news organizations clearly are much more partisan than others. are much more oriented to using, engaging that kind of political instrumentalism. So if economic instrumentalism is really highest at the stock market ownership form, political instrumentalism we find is highest at the privately held form. So
like
when
families
family-owned or individual-owned, or sometimes with a stock market form where there's a dominant shareholder. So in the U.S., a good example of that is the Sinclair Corporation, which is the largest owner of local TV news. They control 40% of the market. And the owners are very conservative, and they've systematically bought up small news channels in swing states they're already conservative. So in a way, they're appealing to that audience, but then they really promote even a stronger conservative viewpoint. And some people argue that that Sinclair played a role in electing Trump because they owned a lot of stations in Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, or not Illinois, but Indiana, some of these states that ultimately went for Trump, just by a few thousand votes. And they've been there's been a lot of complaints by journalists. They've been very heavy-handed. They have what they call must-runs sent from the national office, and stories critical of the Democrats or commentary critical of the left. So that's what I mean by political instrumentalism, and it tends to be higher. It varies. Some private owners try not to be so partisan, but usually if we find this kind of hyper-partisanship, it's at these private ownership.
But also, with regard to political instrumentalism, some media try to differentiate their editorial page, where they openly say what are their political preferences from the news coverage.
That's right.
So do you think like a media outlet could maintain a political position and at the same time have unbiased news coverage?
Yes,
would that be the goal?
Yes, there's been some interesting studies that show there's usually some correlation between the editorial page and the news pages. But the Wall Street Journal actually is a good example of that. That's owned by Rupert Murdoch now. It was owned by another family for years, and it's always had a very conservative editorial page. What has Murdoch done to the paper? He's made that conservative editorial page even more conservative, but he hasn't dramatically changed the news pages, and the news pages have traditionally been much more neutral. And so that's a good example of a news organization that still separates out the news from the editorial.
So I guess the question then would be, do the public reward that sort of neutrality in the news coverage, or do people want partisan coverage?
That's an interesting question, because more and more the audiences are in some ways out of sync with the journalist. Because I think most professional journalists want to try to maintain some kind of balanced, neutral position. But if you look at the audiences for most of the elite media in the U.S., they tend to be either on the right or the left. And so the New York Times audience has become more and more liberal. And I think it's moved the paper a bit to the left as well. But there's a little tension there between what they try to do in the newsroom, or what they think they try to do, and the audience, which is becoming more and more exclusively liberal. And so there's this polarization of audiences. So there's a kind of commercial logic to the partisanship as well. It can be driven not just by the preferences of the owners,
but also the preference of the readers, right?
And so you see that clearly on cable news in the U.S. You've got Fox, which came in and really carved out a niche for conservative news, and they have a conservative audience. For a long time, MSNBC and CNN tried to stay in the middle, and gradually both of them have moved left. CNN a little bit, MSNBC a lot, and so MSNBC is a really interesting case because it's owned by Comcast, which if the owners, if anything, are conservative, but they have not changed the brand. It continues to broadcast. Rachel Maddow and other commentators very critical of Trump. The audience is very liberal, and I think they've made a decision. We've got a market niche here. Let's not fool with success. And so that's a partisanship that's clearly commercially driven. Right. You could almost say it's in some ways cynically commercially driven.
So then what's the third instrumentalization?
So the third mode of ownership power is what I would call public service orientation.
Right.
And so this I think captures the classic view that what the media should do is have some kind of civic obligation to support democracy. And so that might be tied to some, these are analytically separate. A given news organization could be doing all three of these things, but we can separate those out and look at that. So the way we measure this is we look at the amount of investigative reporting, the amount of focus on public affairs in general, and then what's the ideological diversity and the coverage, and do they give voice to civil society, and do they cover international affairs? And so we looked at these kind of four aspects, and here's where you really, I haven't talked about this until now, here's where you bring in public media, like public service broadcasting, like the BBC, and the Scandinavian public media are really strong in this way. And what I call civil society media, nonprofit, trust, foundation-supported media. They can be owned by churches or labor unions or other kinds of associations. They tend to be much smaller scale, but and most of them are online now. But in the U.S., there's been a fantastic growth of these kinds of smaller nonprofit media. I think about over 300 have grown in the last 10 or 15 years. And some of them, like ProPublica, is probably the most famous. This was founded by a lot of ex-New York Times and Wall Street Journal reporters, and they only do investigative reporting. And they go after the left and the right. They go after big business. And so in terms of public service orientation, this kind of civil society media is very strong.
I wanted to ask you specifically about family-owned media.
Yes.
Because in many Latin American countries, and particularly in Chile, that's what we see more. No, we have family names like the Edwards or the Sayes, and more recently the Mochatis in Chile, who own important media outlets.
Yes.
The president of Colombia comes from a media-owning family. So, what is the effect of this kind of media ownership, particularly in terms of pluralism and democracy?
Well, it's the privately held form is I think the most diverse form of ownership, and that you see a lot of variety depending on the family. And so in the U.S., the most famous probably family owning media is the Sulzberger family that owns the New York Times. Although actually technically it's a stock market traded company, but they control the voting share, so they're the dominant shareholder. And there's a great quote from a former editor of the New York Times, and he says, "I wake up every morning thankful for the Sulzbergers." And a lot of people feel that way, that they've been really good to the Times. There was a book about the Sulzberger family called The Trust, and it's passed down through the generations from father to son, only father to son so far, but that they really think of the New York Times as a civic obligation. They have their politics too, but they've definitely, they've foregone some profits, let's put it that way. The stock market price has gone way down. If they were just thinking in terms of money, they would have sold this newspaper a long time ago. So
then it depends on the values of the family, basically.
It depends on the values of the family. So, and so what we're seeing right now is in some ways the stock market is letting go of a lot of media because the media are not as profitable as they used to be. So, especially newspapers. So, the Washington Post was sold. A lot of regional newspapers in Minneapolis, in Boston, they've been bought up by local individuals. A lot of times these people own the local sports team, so they see it as a way to promote their sports team. And so, the Atlantic magazine was bought by Maureen Powell Jobs, who's the heiress of the Jobs Apple fortune.
Steve Jobs.
And so people said, this is great, they're like these saviors of the media, these benevolent billionaires. And you have to say, well, it depends. And you have to wonder, what's their axe to grind? I mean, they probably have something, and often they'll say, yeah, I really believe in this cause. So it's not necessarily bad if they're not all the same. I think what's of concern is a lot of these people they're bringing Silicon Valley wealth, and they're from internet companies. And so to the extent that a lot of this new ownership is from Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is a bigger and bigger part of the economy, are we going to lose critical reporting of the U.S. economy, which is based in Silicon Valley? So clearly it can be a problem. So no form of ownership is perfect. Just to say a little bit more about public media, and what I think the value of that is that if it works well, if it needs to have administrative protections, buffers from partisan political control. So whether it's conservatives or liberals in power, the public broadcaster has to have some autonomy, like you see with the BBC. It has to be well funded. I know TVN is only getting advertising funding, so usually the strongest...
It's not public, it's not like,
yeah, it's
not even like PBS.
Public. So the strongest public media in Northern Europe are getting totally public funds. You know, the value of that kind of form of media, if it works well, is that it's both quality and it's reaching a broad public. And so the problem in the US more and more is you have elite media, whether it's privately held, like the New York Times, or civil society owned, it's reaching smaller and smaller elite audience. And so we're getting more and more quality media aimed at the same elite audience, and the broader public is either getting, you know,
poor quality,
misinformation,
right.
Disinformation, sensationalism, news mixed with advertising, as in the BuzzFeed model, which is you got the kind of native advertising mixed in with the news, and you don't know if what you're reading is an ad or a news article. And so, or you get the kind of Fox News or other kinds of far-right partisan media that's really distorted. So it's it's a problem. We don't have in the U.S. We have very small public media. We have this nonprofit media. It's quality media, but it's not reaching most
broad
people.
audiences. So, with regard to the role of the state in this public media, I know the U.S. has a strong fear of Big Brother and the intervention of the government. And it's not like that everywhere. In France, it's not like that. In Chile, it's not like that. People here expect social demands often to be met by the state. So people say any problem there is, people demand the presence of the state. So with regard to media ownership, how do you assess the role of state-owned media? Under which conditions could they fulfill a public good role, or you think they're doomed to be an arm of governmental propaganda? How can you make the state intervention to be positive?
Yeah, just to kind of elaborate what I was saying about the BBC or the Scandinavian media or Germany, you know, it's not a matter of state ownership or not, but how it's set up. So you have to. Shouldn't be really directly owned by the state, but it has some kind of independent agency with its own board. You could have staggered terms of the directors, have them appointed by different political parties, have the funding separated from the general taxes, so it's just a designated tax license fee that goes directly to all these things are what make a public broadcaster independent. We don't really have that in the U.S. We don't have, the money comes from general taxes, it's very low funding, there's political interference, all the things you don't want to have, we have in the U.S. Despite that, PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service, does some good work, NPR, National, but they do some good work. There's a frontline investigative report for PBS. They do some good work, even under bad conditions. So I think it's important to have public broadcasting, even if...
But they're asking for money all the time. When you listen to the radio, support from NPR.
Well, so what you have in the U.S. is it's a hybrid form. It's partial state public, partial nonprofit. It's about half and half. And some people think that's a good way to do it. I think it's the worst. In some ways, it's the worst of all possible ways, because they're desperate for money, and there's been some abuses of power where they took money and they had to give it back later because often the donors are big corporations, and they call it sponsorship, not advertising, but they expect something in return.
So there is a danger in this idea of civil society funded media.
There's a danger in all these forms of ownership. So that's why I support a pluralist system with different forms of ownership.
So with regard to this emergence of multiple sources of information, I think today elites have less control of the agenda than in the past. We just saw this with the Mapuche peasant that was murdered yesterday by a policeman. And today Chileans have access to, people are seeing videos of his house, of the family, of children crying when the police enter the community of Temucuicui. So newspapers today in Chile are less efficient than they would have been in the past to downplay what's going on. But on the other hand, this sort of democratizing of information has as a counterpart, the emergence of fake news and all kinds of disinformation that may be a threat for the formation of democratic audiences. Some people have said that, made a simile with the idea that in a flood, what is more needed is water, no? Mm-hmm. And so there seems to be a need for more regulation of this new media flow, of these new ways of flows of information. So how would you characterize this dilemma of an increased diversity vis-a-vis the maintenance of professional standards of journalism?
Right, complex question. So I think that, I think first of all, even if it sometimes seems futile, it's important to get more quality news into the system and hope that it will circulate and make every effort to circulate the good news. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you do about the bad news, the misinformation? I think that there's a growing pressure, growing call for some kind of regulation of Facebook or Twitter or some of these, because they have so much control and they're not obviously engaging in serious self-regulation. Mm-hmm. They know they need to do something. We've seen new revelations every day.
Of the Russian intervention in the election.
And about Facebook's refusal to even try to do anything. In fact, right. Quite the opposite. And because they're so profit-driven that there was a headline today I saw that was, Facebook is amoral. Mm-hmm. That they just right. They don't care, or they don't. They're not trying. Right. Not to say it's easy mm-hmm. to find the fake news, mm-hmm. but there are ways to do it, and they have so much control over the flow of news now that I think there's a sense that something has to happen. So I think even in the U.S., even across the different political parties, there is a growing will to think about regulation of Facebook and other social media, and in a way that kind of maybe is a way to get around the concern about regulation of journalism, because it's the pipes through which journalism arrives at people, right? Not the content creators themselves. Mm-hmm.
So you think pressure is because it's increasing to regulate, because this is now affecting one group, but it could affect another group in the future.
Right. So it has to be nonpartisan. It has to be not seen as, some conservatives are trying to make this partisan and say, oh, you're just trying to shut down conservative voices. Mm-hmm. But they may come to regret that in the future when they see themselves attacked maybe mm-hmm. from extreme left. Mm-hmm. So hopefully there's some will to do that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in your lecture on Wednesday, you mentioned how subscription media may enhance the knowledge gap by making quality journalism available only to elites. However, newspapers and magazines were always paid in the past. In the past, people always paid for their news.
Right.
And so it was a combination of advertising and subscription that allowed for the great investigative journalism of the Watergate style. So how has the emergence of online media changed that, and how do you perceive the role of the media today as a mechanism of political accountability?
Well, it's interesting, because I think a lot of us who criticized advertising often said, well, maybe we should have more subscriptions, maybe mm-hmm. we should have more, rely on the readers more. And so now it's a case of be careful what you ask for, because that definitely does reduce the audience and it becomes more exclusive. Right. Actually, if you look at the Washington Post in the 70s and the major U.S. media in the 70s and 80s, probably the high point of the kind of win-win situation where people felt, well, they were making money and they were also doing good work. The majority of the funding in the U.S. was still coming from advertising. So mm-hmm. the price of the cost of buying a newspaper was still pretty low, artificially lowered by all the advertising money. Right. So now the advertising money has gone down and down and down, and then they're raising the cost of the subscription. So it is excluding more people than I think the old subscriptions. And I think that has an effect. If it's behind the paywall, it's not reaching as many people. And so some of the best news, even the people who would want quality news and the people who really need quality news, are not able to get it now. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a problem. I saw one tweet by a journalist, British journalist who I think had been to The Guardian, and then she went to the Financial Times, and she got a tweet from this steel worker who was saying, "That's great for you, but horrible for me because now I can't read your work. I can't afford the Financial Times." So there's quality media out there. If it's behind a paywall,
so everybody's reading The Guardian now.
Well, no, the Guardian is the Guardian's trying to have it all still, and
they ask you for money, but you can still read it.
That's right, and
But the New York Times, you can't read it. Once you reach your 5 free articles, that's it.
They give you a few.
Very few.
And I feel fortunate, if you're a teacher or a professor in the U.S.,
you get the right.
But the normal commercial rate is very high, and so I'm sure that excludes a lot of people.
Yeah, and the influence abroad, because in the rest of the world, people are also reading those influential media,
right.
and so people get more restricted. It's still elites, but elites are important for opinion formation.
And it's funny, I wrote something about this in an academic journal, and someone tweeted it, and then they tried to find the article, and it's behind a paywall. So the irony of that, because a lot of our academic research is behind a paywall too.
Not to talk about that's a different issue, but all the problems to access academic production,
right.
all the paid journals and databases.
Right. So I think there's still ways to get quality work out there. Some of the the nonprofit media is by definition not behind a paywall. So then it's just a matter of being proactive and trying to circulate it. So there's different ways to do that. Sometimes nonprofit media can partner with commercial media to help circulate their work. And so ProPublica does that with the New York Times, although the New York Times doesn't send it to everyone. But sometimes even with local TV. So I know some local nonprofits, for instance, in San Diego, partner with a local NBC
so they can
TV station
reproduce
it to a much broader audience. They'd have a little special segment on
they're like
local TV news. And the local TV news likes it because it's free content, and they don't want to have to pay for the news gathering anymore. So it's a symbiotic, can be a symbiotic relationship. The problem is that then it kind of pushes the nonprofits in a more commercial direction because their stuff is not going to get picked up unless it meets commercial criteria. So there's all of these dilemmas, and you just have to hope that some of the good work is getting through. But I think a lot more thought could go into it, and the foundations have not in the U.S. been as proactive as I think they could be. They're starting to realize this, because when they initially supported nonprofit media, their model was, we're going to step in and we're going to support nonprofit media until they find a new business model. So it's just this temporary band-aid we're providing, and we want to encourage them to be market sustainable. That's not happening, because if the market was sustaining that kind of work, they wouldn't need the nonprofits. And so now foundations realize they need to stay in for the long term as well. They need to support the operational funding, not just project-based funding. And they need to think about this issue of who the audience is, because they were actually encouraging some nonprofits to actually kind of follow the commercial elite model. So just produce your work for a small elite, and these are people will donate, and you'll have more impact on the policy level. But then it became a very kind of narrow model. It was still open in principle to a broad audience, but they weren't making much effort to reach a broader audience. So I think that's the next frontier. A lot of us are talking about this. I know the director of the Nieman Foundation at Harvard is really interested in the subject as well, and I've talked about this at several conferences. I think this issue of exclusion, journalism isn't an agent of inclusion. It should be.
And it's becoming more and more segmented.
And not all journalism, but the quality journalism. And then what's available to the larger public is a lot of trash, really.
Okay, so thank you so much for bringing this very important issue for democracy and for our work on conflict and cohesion here at the COES. And thank you so much for the interview.